This is the third lecture in my series on the birth of tragedy. What we've done so far is we've looked at these two notions, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and how they worked out in Greek culture. What they were in themselves, how they could enter in sort of interplay, the fact that they were not the only possible responses to the problem of life as Nietzsche saw it. Then we talked about tragedy itself, how tragedy developed, particularly with these two guys, Aeschylus and Sophocles, the tragic vision of things, how it in some ways fused or united or brought into a dialectical both opposition and productive tension, these two forces of the Apollonian and the Dionysiac. Which elements conform to what? Remember the chorus is Dionysian, Dionysiac, and the dialogue is Apollonian. Where we have to go now is to look at a third possible response to the problem of life, which comes to supplant both the Apollonian and the Dionysiac, and comes to produce what Nietzsche calls tragedy's death. It's not enough to call a piece a tragedy or to have a certain structure to it for it to actually be tragedy in Nietzsche's eyes. It has to have this interconnection of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and it can't just have traits of that. It actually has to have those running through it. And Nietzsche thinks that there's a dramatic cultural shift that takes place in the plays of Euripides and also in the figure of Socrates towards what he calls Alexandrian culture. So that's what we're focusing on today. We're looking at sections 11 through 17 primarily, the undoing of the dynamic synthesis between the Dionysiac and the Apollonian, and the replacement culturally in Greek culture by the Socratic-Alexandrian response. So this is a response that Nietzsche identifies in particular with Euripides as a playwright, also with the New Comedy, with Plato and his teacher Socrates, and with Alexandrian culture. What does he mean by Alexandrian culture? Very often we make a distinction between Hellenic and Hellenistic. And Hellenistic is the culture that comes about after or through the conquests of Alexander the Great. Remember, Alexander the Great is from Macedon, which is a semi-barbarous country to the north of Greece. The Greeks themselves in the peninsula had been fighting against each other for a long time. Macedon comes in, takes them over under Philip of Macedon, who then is assassinated. His son Alexander takes over, and what does he do? He takes on the ancient enemy of the Greeks, the great Persian Empire, conquers it, takes over Asia Minor, the Levant, the Middle East, Egypt. Alexandria is founded and named after him. The rest of the Persian Empire was nowadays Iraq, Iran, portions of Afghanistan, pushes all the way to the boundaries of India, at which point his troops say, we've had enough. He settles his soldiers throughout his new kingdom, and the new states that arise there, the successor states, are deeply imbued with Greek culture. But are they imbued with classic Greek culture, or are they imbued with something that's in some ways more superficial? That's what Nietzsche would ask. And he thinks that the answer is the latter, that it's something that in some ways is more superficial and yet has a vitality of its own. So that's what we're going to look at today. He calls this Antideonisiac. This Socratic-Alexandrian response is opposed to the Dionysiac in part because it doesn't truly understand it. The Apollonian was also opposed to the Dionysiac, but in a very different way. Remember, the Apollonian, it establishes its own limits, and it doesn't push all the time. It doesn't try to destroy or wipe out the Dionysiac. The Socratic impulse is to actually do so. It tries to replace it with something new and more valuable, something which would be completely true, completely good, completely consistent. Those become the hallmark values. Nietzsche, in a later section, writes the Alexandrian response as one of three kinds of illusion that answer only to noble natures. So this is a very important point to stress and to rest on for a minute. Nietzsche was not saying, I made this very clear in the first lecture, that all artwork is either Apollonian or Dionysiac. That's not the case. Nor is all artwork on a continuum of Apollonian and Dionysiac, nor is it all necessarily a fusion of it. There can be some artwork that has no Apollonian or Dionysiac elements to it whatsoever. This is not an exclusive dichotomy, nor is the addition of the Alexandrian Socratic response making it a trichotomy, so that everything would either be this, or this, or this, or a mixture of those. He says that these are responses that correspond to noble natures, who resent the burden of existence more deeply than the rest, and who therefore require special beguilements to make them forget this burden. What are some of the other possible responses? Nietzsche would say that you could have sort of purely mercenary or slavish pursuits, which would not actually for that be Dionysian. Just trying to forget things doesn't make you a Dionysiac. There has to be more involved than just drinking and having a good time. Trying to gain power is not necessarily Apollonian. It could be just pursuing power for its own sake, not for the sake of the true, the beautiful, the good, which is the Socratic-Alexandrian response in large respect. The Socratic response is something new, something bringing an originality to the game. It's novel. It is, in that sense, creative or productive. But it's creative or productive in a kind of repressive or forgetful way as well. But Nietzsche does not see Socrates as merely what he calls an agent of disintegration. Socrates is contributing, Euripides is contributing something new, something that Nietzsche is combating, but something that he can recognize as a novel contribution. Socrates, he says, and this is very important, is the vortex and the turning point of Western civilization. So that's actually answering a question that may occur to some viewers or some readers. Why do we care about the Greeks at all? Why do we care about all this Apollonian, Dionysiac, Euripides, Aristophanes' view on him, Aeschylus, all this rigmarole? Isn't this all just old dead white? Well, they're not actually white because they're Greek, and the Greeks had no conception of themselves at the time as white versus something else. But isn't this sort of dead white European male stuff, if we want to put it into that paradigm? How does this apply to anything today? Well, Nietzsche thinks that Western civilization in general, and I think that you could also read other responses within modernity outside of the sphere of a European, American, liberal democracies as such. I think you could read some of this into that. Nietzsche thinks that what we're dealing here is something that has come to dominate the modern mindset, the scientific mindset. And he's looking for something like this to come on the scene to replace it, a renewal. That's why we want to study the Greeks, because they have something new today to contribute to us. It's not just about how to read Aeschylus and make sense out of him better for his own sake. It's about how to revive within a culture that has become sort of imbued with this Socratic-Alexandrian point of view, how to revive something that won't just replicate that'll actually go deeper to the roots of what it is that we need as human beings. So, Socrates is the vortex and the turning point of Western civilization. How do we get there? Let's start with Euripides and tragedy. What happened and why did it happen and what were its effects? So, this is going straight to the text. Nietzsche says that tragedy dies, well, how? By suicide, leaving a tremendous vacuum. Perished in a manner quite different from its older sister arts. It died by suicide in consequence of an insoluble conflict, while the others died serene natural deaths at advanced age. What was this insoluble conflict? Well, we're going to get to that in a moment. That's going to arise through Socrates and Euripides. What ends up being the effects? This is really interesting. He says, when after all a new genre sprang into being which honored tragedy as its parent, the child was seen with dismay to bear indeed the features of its mother, but of its mother during her long death struggle. The death struggle of tragedy had been fought by Euripides, while the later art is known as New Attic comedy. New Attic comedy will go on to play a major role in the Roman world. A lot of early Roman plays were just sort of taking Greek plays and transposing them. And New Attic comedy, probably one of the closest things that we have to it these days are bad sitcoms, where you have stock characters and interesting things are happening, but they don't really have any great significance. I suppose, in a way, if you take seriously its claim to be a show about nothing, the Seinfeld show could have been something like new comedy, you know. Not even nihilistic in the sense of like tearing down everything and destroying values, just sort of nihilistically there. That's the product that comes about. Now, like it says, New Attic comedy follows in the wake of Euripides, who brings the spectator onto the stage. It's the common man, the individual, who enjoys Euripides drama and New Attic comedy. Why? Because there's this enjoyment of lowering things to a more common or ordinary level, of seeing their selves portrayed on the stage. He says, here's a contrast. Once we realize out of what substance the Promethean dramatists before Euripides had formed their heroes, how far it had been from their thoughts to bring onto the stage a true replica of actuality, we shall see clearly how utterly different were those intentions of Euripides. Through him, the common man found his way from the auditorium onto the stage. Odysseus, the typical Greek of older art, declined under the hands of the new poet to the characters of Graeculus, who henceforth held the center of the stage as, this is Graeculus the type, the good-humored, cunning slave. Now every spectator could behold his exact counterpart on the Euripidean stage and was delighted to find him so eloquent. This is another important thing as well. Euripides is affecting the culture in part by, as he says, teaching people how to speak, which is a phrase that's put into his mouth, interestingly enough, not by a new comedian, but by one of the old comedians who is actually sort of pointing himself against Socrates and Euripides and defending older tragedy against their new response, and that is Aristophanes. Euripides is making some sort of claim like that. He says, through him the populace had learned to observe, make transactions, and form conclusions according to all the rules of art with the utmost cleverness. It was through this revolution in public discourse that the new comedy became possible. From now on, the stock phrases to represent everyday affairs were ready to hand. People are able to come up with cliches to make sense out of their day-to-day existence. And so art begins to pervade everyday existence because everyday existence begins to pervade art and the highest of arts. So the audience for new comedy, like he says, is now enlightened and prepared. They're a crowd that Euripides could serve as a choir master for. And like he says, as soon as this chorus had acquired a competence in the Euripidean key, the new comedy, that chess-like species of play with its constant triumphs of cleverness and cunning, arose. Meanwhile, choir master Euripides was the object of fulsome praise. And what's going on here? What is the effect? It produces a kind of facsimile of the Greek Serenity that came with the Apollonian, and even more with the mixture of the Apollonian and the Dionysiac. He says, Hellenism's supreme deities at that point become wit, whim, caprice, the pleasure of the moment. The fifth estate, that of the slaves, comes into its own, at least in point of attitude, and if it is now at all possible to speak of Greek serenity, then it must refer to the serenity of the slave, who has no difficult responsibilities, no high aims, and to whom nothing past or future is of greater value than the present. You know, it's interesting. When we talk about slavery, for Americans, the first association is typically to the slavery that we had prior to and including during the time of the Civil War. And that was pretty horrific. That was a race-based slavery that was used as an economic system to prop up the South, and which is tied in with, you know, if you look at the ideology, it's tied in with all sorts of ideas of chivalry in the South, along with all sorts of notions of the other, there to be exploited. Slavery had its terrible aspects in the ancient world, but slavery was also a widespread institution, as it has been in every civilization that reaches a certain point of development until modern times. In some ways, slavery is more horrific in modern times just because it's not a ubiquitous institution. So when it occurs, it's much more clear, the oppositions between freedom and slavery. Now, the slave in ancient society didn't have it great, but they typically didn't have it terrible unless they were doing things like mining lead or salt, or, you know, working in galleys or things like that. So long as you did your work, you could probably expect, you know, food, lodging, you know, some guidance on what to do in life, and even some degree of freedom, depending on, you know, what exactly your duties were. And it freed you from having to think about things. Slaves don't run the society. Slaves don't make the big decisions. So, you know, in some ways, you can be much more free and happy just letting somebody else call all the shots for you. I mean, if it bothers you to think about this in terms of slavery, think about the person who is suddenly thrown into chaos when their job that, you know, it's the only job they actually trained for and planned on doing their whole life, and is not particularly demanding once you've learned how to get by in it, gets eliminated. And now suddenly, they were very happy before, making a paycheck, you know, see your friends at work, and just, you know, do what you need to do. Don't think about economic forces. Don't think about whether the company is profitable or not. That's all for the owners to worry about, or the managers to worry about. I'm just a worker. Suddenly the job gets eliminated, and the person becomes politically conscious, and oh, we have to do something about this. But they lost their serenity. What was the serenity that they had? I'm just going to keep going on and on over here, and I'll have my vacations, my weekends. I'm not going to think about this or where things are going. That's not going to bother me. I can be entertained. I can be a consumer as well as a worker. Well, that would be something analogous to what Nietzsche is talking about here in terms of the slave mentality. To go back to Euripides now. Euripides does not actually pander to the audience, though. This is a really important point. Euripides is being criticized for pandering to the lower class, for pandering to the common people. Some people want to see in that, you know, sort of democracy triumphing over aristocracy or oligarchy. Well, what's actually going on? Euripides is training the audience for something that he himself is being driven by. So he's not pandering to the audience. He's in some ways making the audience come along with him, pandering to something else. Two other audiences, two spectators who are not the crowd. So Who is this other spectator? Well, let me read you this passage. Euripides considered himself to be quite superior to the crowd as a whole, not however to two of his spectators. He would translate the crowd onto the stage, but insist all the same on reverencing the two members as the sole judges of his art, on following all their directions and admonitions, and on instilling in the very hearts of his dramatic characters those emotions, passions, and recognitions which had heretofore seconded the stage action like an invisible chorus from the serried ranks of the amphitheater. It was in deference to these judges that he gave his new characters a new voice to and a new music. Their votes and no others determined for him the worth of his efforts. Of the two spectators I just spoke of was Euripides himself. But now notice what Nietzsche says here. The thinker Euripides, not the poet. So Euripides is in fact a thinker, and then he's trying to translate this into poetry. So he says, endowed with such talent, such remarkable intellectual lucidity and versatility, Euripides watched the performances of his predecessors' plays and tried to rediscover in them those fine lineaments which age, as happens in the case of old paintings, have darkened and almost obliterated. Euripides is a scholarly, spectatorly playwright. He is observing the people who came before him and saying, okay, let's actually watch this. Now, what works here? How could I replicate that? What's of the essence of this thing that works? Why does this work? Why does this not work? I'm not just going to get rid of this part that doesn't work. I want to know why it doesn't work so I can make sure I don't do things like that in other cases. And what did Euripides actually learn? Well, he says, Euripides perceived in every line and every trait something quite incommensurable, a certain deceptive clarity, and together with it a mysterious depth and infinite background. What is that? Well, a certain deceptive clarity, that's the Apollonian, together with it a mysterious depth and infinite background. That's the Dionysiac. The clearest figure trailed after it a comet's tail which seemed to point to something uncertain, something which could not be wholly elucidated. A similar twilight seemed to invest the very structure of drama, especially the function of the chorus. So Euripides, is thinking about these things. How do these work? He's trying to bring everything into the scrutiny of the spectator, the perfect spectator himself. Then he says, then again, how ambiguous did the solutions of all moral problems seem? How problematical the way in which the myths were treated? How irregular the distributions of fortune and misfortune? There was also much in the language of older tragedy he took exception to. Why all this elevated language, these tropes and hyperboles? So there's, the Apollonian elements, Euripides doesn't really have that big of a problem with. The Dionysiac elements, he really does. He doesn't fully understand what's going on with them. And so his goal is to eliminate the Dionysian and rebuild tragedy as better. So think of it as taking an old building and you're going to gut all the parts of it that don't seem to be entirely up to snuff. But you didn't realize that, well, that was a load-bearing wall that you just tore down. That's what ends up happening, according to Nietzsche. Who's the second spectator? So that's Euripides. The second spectator is Socrates. And Euripides, why is he so interested in Socrates himself? Well, as Nietzsche says, in a certain sense, Euripides was but a mask, while the divinity which spoke through him was neither Dionysos nor Apollo, but a brand new daemon called Socrates. Thenceforth, the real antagonism was to be between the Dionysiac spirit and the Socratic tragedy was to perish in the conflict. Let us look now more closely at the Socratic tendency by means of which Euripides fought and conquered Aeschylean tragedy. So Euripides is try to make sense out of things using a mindset that is coming essentially from Socrates. And what happens to tragedy when you pull the Dionysiac out? It says, once it was no longer begotten by music, in the mysterious Dionysiac twilight, what form could drama conceivably take? Only that of the dramatized epic, an Apollonian form which precluded tragic effect. So, as we left off before, when you abandon Dionysus, Apollo is soon going to leave as well. So, he asks, what relationship can be said to obtain between an ideal Apollonian drama and the plays of Euripides? The same as obtains between the early solemn rhapsodist, the rhapsodist being the one who essentially reenacts the language, redoes the epic, recites it, doing so calmly, allowing people to contemplate the images carried out in words. So, the early solemn rhapsodist, and then more recent variety described in Plato's Ion. If you read Plato's dialogue, the Ion, Socrates is discussing with a rhapsode named Ion, who's just won some prizes. What is it that you do? And he gets some very interesting descriptions, and he says, do you actually know anything? Does Homer know anything? Does anybody that you're working with know anything? Or is it all just by sort of divine inspiration? That ends up being the position. But what Nietzsche is focused on here is that this passage, when I say something sad, my eyes fill with tears. If, however, what I say is terrible and ghastly, then my hair stands on end and my heart beats loudly. Now, that's not, despite not being Apollonian, that's not a Dionysiac response either. It's not losing oneself in sort of this primal, ongoing drama of life. It's focusing in on the very specific. When I talk about something sad, my eyes fill with tears. When I talk about this particular sad thing, say Penelope mourning for Odysseus when she thinks that he's lost, that's going to be Socratic or Euripidean. There's a loss of detachment, a loss of illusion. And how is new tragedy going to exert an effect? Nietzsche talks about it having to use novel stimulants. So, like he says, it cannot possibly achieve the Apollonian effects of the epic, while on the other hand it severed all connection with the Dionysiac, so that in order to have any impact at all, it must seek out novel stimulants which are to be found neither in the Apollonian nor in the Dionysiac realm. Where are they to be found then? So this is a good example for showing that Apollonian and Dionysiac are not exclusive, exhaustive categories. There are other things outside of them. Novel stimulants. He says those stimulants are, on the one hand, cold paradoxical ideas put in the place of the Apollonian contemplation. Cold paradoxical ideas, rather than images that one looks at but doesn't try to probe all the way to the bottom. On the other hand, fiery emotions put in place of the Dionysiac transports. The last are splendidly realistic counterfeits, but neither ideas nor affects are infused with the spirit of true art, he says. So, what should we say about these substitutions? Is there something radically new going on here? It's not as if people didn't feel these things before. So Euripides is bringing into existence things that people already do feel, but perhaps hadn't put into poetry. This is doing subjective art, like Nietzsche talked about last time, when he said that the true artist is only objective. This becomes very subjective. And not in the sense that everybody makes of it what they do, in the sense that it's focused on the individual subject. So, what else is going on? There's something that Nietzsche calls aesthetic Socratism. And what does he mean by this? He means that there's certain maxims or certain mottos, certain statements that you can take as fundamentally basic. Whatever is beautiful must also be sensible. What must make sense. Knowledge alone makes men virtuous and happy. And so if you have these as sort of the backdrop of your artistic vision, you're going to write plays very differently than somebody who believes that reality is ultimately at bottom a set of conflicts and contradictions in which each part by itself makes sense, but the whole, on its own does not make sense. If you have that sort of vision, then you can write like Shakespeare does, or you can write like Kafka does, or you can write like Aeschylus does. If, on the other hand, you think that ultimately whatever is to be beautiful must be sensible, knowledge alone makes men virtuous and therefore happy, then you have no other choice than to write as Euripides does. And so Euripides becomes the first rational maker of tragedy, Nietzsche says. So let's now switch and talk about Socrates, the second spectator. There's a very interesting digression by Nietzsche, how Socrates and Euripides are similar and connected with each other. He says, Aristophanes treats both men half indignant, half contemptuously to the dismay of the rising generation. The rising generation were willing to sacrifice Euripides, and they could not forgive the picture of Socrates as the arch sophist. So they end up taking revenge on Aristophanes. Why does Aristophanes connect them together? Like he says, it was Socrates who expressed most clearly this radically new prestige of knowledge and conscious intelligence when he claimed to be the only one who acknowledged himself that he knew nothing. He roams all over Athens, running across poets, politicians, rhapsodes, householders, other philosophers and sophists. And what does he do each time? He sort of tears them down and gets them to have to admit that, whether they like it or not, that they actually don't know what they claim to know. There's a new ideal. Along with this ideal, setting knowledge way up here in a conscious life, a life that would be sort of pure lucidity. Everything else gets pushed down. Everything else gets lowered, particularly anything that has some mystery, some shadow to it. And so there's a denigration or demotion of other people, other disciplines, other ways of life, as not having knowledge, as getting by on instinct or knack, something unconscious, something that can't give, as Plato has Socrates say, can't give an account of itself. Now this is not just an opposition between a new ideal of knowledge and an actuality of non-knowledge. It's not just somebody going around and saying, I really want to know what everybody else knows, let me see if they do know anything, and then finding that they don't, and then saying, I guess none of us know anything. There's a desire here, there's a demand here, something consuming, something that in some ways lights a fire. You might think of Socrates' speech at the Apology where he says, you kill me, and other people are going to come along and do the same thing as me, but they're not going to be so nice. So maybe you ought to think twice about killing me. He's making a real threat. Socrates ignites a movement. What is this movement aimed at doing? Not just pointing out failures or lacks of pure knowledge, understanding. It's aimed at correcting the situation. That's the drive. That's what's most productive in this Socratic, Euripidean, Alexandrian response. And so Socrates as the spectator, imagine what he's going to bring to tragedy. Anything that doesn't make pure sense is probably something that you have to get rid of if you want to be rational about it, right? The reactive character of Socrates' daimon is the logical side becomes hypertrophy. The instinctive side, the Dionysiac side, becomes purely negative rather than positive. What does Socrates actually see in tragedy? He sees it as fundamentally irrational, not communicating truth, as misrepresenting things. except for Euripides' tragedy, which is supposed to be representing things as they really are, not mythically, not leaving things that you have to ferret or figure out yourself. So the features of tragedy that are Dionysiac in the Socratic view, the music, the chorus, as Nietzsche says, optimistic dialectics took up the whip of its syllogisms and drove music out of tragedy. And we'll come back to the Socratic approach. There's one digression that Nietzsche makes regarding Plato that I think is very important to talk about as well. And there's a reason why I put Platonic Dialogue here with Euripides and Tragedy leading to New Comedy. Plato starts out as a poet and an athlete too, by the way. Plato, broad back, he's a big guy. He's also a nobleman. But he's a poet. He wants to be a tragic poet. He burns his poetry, his youthful efforts. Why? Because he's captivated with this man and the way of life that he's putting forth, the ideal that he's putting forth. He develops a new art form, as Nietzsche says, deeply akin to the existing forms which he had repudiated. If you read Platonic Dialogues, and it may sometimes, depending on the translation, take reading them in the Greek for this to come out. The best one, by the way, for the examples of this is the Symposium. You will see Plato actually taking bits and pieces of all sorts of other forms of poetry, all other genres, and weaving them into his own dialogue. Not just poetry, too, by the way. Medical treatise, for example, with Eryximachus in the Symposium. Oratory, like the rhetors. He weaves Gorgian rhetoric into Agathon's speech. He takes a speech by Lysias and actually brings that whole thing into the Phaedrus and has them discussing it. Platonic dialogue is assimilative. It takes the other forms of poetry, but it also breaks them down in part. It loses something of their spirit, and it misunderstands them in Nietzsche's view. Tragedy had assimilated the previous artistic genres. Epic, Nietzsche doesn't talk about this, but epic, I think, can arguably be said to have done something similar. Now, Plato would do something along the same lines, only raised to a higher level. So it becomes a mixture of all the other poetry, and Nietzsche makes a very strange remark at a certain point. He says, Plato has furnished for all posterity the pattern of a new art, for the novel, viewed as the Aesopian fable raised to the highest power. So he's saying, and I think when somebody like Nietzsche says something like this, given the fact that he was a philologist, a classicist, and he spent so much time thinking about this, when he says that the Platonic dialogue somehow leads to the novel, the early novel in the Alexandrian culture, I think maybe there's something worth thinking about there. We can't dwell on this very much, but it is worth noting. What happens with the Apollonian and the Dionysiac? Socrates, like he says, becomes the dialectical hero. So once this is Socrates, the dialectical hero of the Platonic drama, shows a close affinity to the Euripidean hero, who is compelled to justify his actions by proof and counterproof, and for that reason is often in danger of forfeiting our tragic compassion. For who among us can close his eyes to the optimistic element in the nature of dialectics, which sees a triumph in every syllogism and can breathe only in an atmosphere of cool, conscious clarity? Stop and think for a moment, if you've read them, about the picture of Socrates as he's about to die in the Credo and in the Phaedo. Is that tragic? Or is it optimistic? Does it arouse in us sympathy? Does it awaken our feelings in a sense? Or is it trying to get us to go away from them towards the life of the intellect? Nietzsche goes on, once that optimistic element had entered tragedy, it overgrew its Dionysiac regions and brought about their annihilation and finally the leap into genteel domestic drama. Consider the consequences of the Socratic maxims. Virtue is knowledge. All sins arise from ignorance. Only the virtuous are happy. These three basic foundations of optimism spell the death of tragedy. The virtuous hero must henceforth be a dialectician. Virtue and knowledge, belief and ethics be necessarily and demonstrably connected. Aeschylus's transcendental concept of justice, reduced to the brash and shallow principle of poetic justice, with its regular deus ex machina. So that is going to end up destroying tragedy, like it says. So the Socratic approach, virtue and knowledge, belief and ethics have to be necessarily, demonstrably connected. Socrates is sort of the model of the new theoretical man, whose significance and aims Nietzsche says we must now attempt to understand. Like the artist, theoretical man takes infinite pleasure in all that exists and is thus saved from the practical ethics of pessimism. While the artist, having unveiled the truth garment by garment, remains with his gaze fixed on what is still hidden, theoretical man takes delight in the garments, in the cast garments, and finds his highest satisfaction in the unveiling process itself, which proves to him his own power. There's an experience. You've probably all experienced this when you've studied something and it made sense to you, and you worked through something. There's sort of a deep-seated illusion that Nietzsche thinks is integral to the theoretical man and to the scientific attitude and the modern scientific, technological, consumerist culture. It says, a type of deep-seated illusion first manifested in Socrates, the illusion that thought, guided by the thread of causation, might plumb the farthest abysses of being and even correct it. So whereas the Apollonian and the Dionysiac are responses to the problem of being, ultimately remember, what is being for Nietzsche? It has no meaning, it just is, and we're stuck with that. The Socratic response is, we can do something about that. We can fix that. We can create meaning. We can discover the meaning that is truly there. It's optimistic in that way. This grand metaphysical illusion, Nietzsche says, has become integral to the scientific endeavor and again leads science to those far limits of its inquiry where it becomes art, which in this mechanism is what is really intended. That's a really brilliant thing to notice on Nietzsche's part. We often think of scientists as being sort of passionless, dominated by the intellect. Nietzsche is saying, no, the scientific endeavor itself is just as fully engaged in terms of the desires, the emotions, affectivity, the heart. And that's what allows the scientist to actually do the work that he or she does, very often counterintuitively. And to think, yeah, this is going to pay off, you know. So he says, if we examine Socrates in the light of this idea, he strikes us as the first who is able not only to live under the guidance of that instinctive scientific certainty, but to die by it, to be a martyr to it. For this reason, the image of the dying Socrates, mortal man freed by knowledge and argument from the fear of death, is the emblem which, hanging above the portal of every science, reminds the adept his mission is to make existence appear intelligible. This is very important. Appear intelligible and thereby justified. And here he notes another thing too. If you go through the whole thing in dialectics and science and knowledge and understanding can't get you to that point where not only everything makes sense, but also makes sense in a bigger way, you know, it's not only intelligible but justifiable, well then that's when you go and use myth. That's when you tell a story. That's what mythos means, story. That's when you lapse into poetry again. Now, he says, under this viewpoint, everything comes to be seen as teachable, as knowable. And in a way, that's to deform the reality of certain things. Now, one of the things that could be a response to this is what he calls a pessimistic response, response, which Schopenhauer takes, and also he sees in Buddhism and Hinduism and other certain cultural responses. Against this practical pessimism, he says Socrates represents the archetype of the theoretical optimist who's strong in the belief that nature can be fathomed, considers knowledge to be the true panacea and error to be the radical evil. Now, what is the result of this? We have a culture where, like he says, since the time of Socrates, the mechanism of concepts, judgments, and syllogisms has come to be regarded as the highest exercise of man's power. If there is the best part in us, what is it? That's always been a classic discussion. For the Socratic response, it's the intellect disengaged from all of this other stuff. Nature's most admirable gift. Socrates and his successors down to our own day have considered all moral and sentimental accomplishments, noble deeds, compassion, self-sacrifice, heroism, even that spiritual calm, which the Apollonian Greek called sophrosune, to be ultimately derived from the dialectic of knowledge, and therefore teachable. And he says, if we look about today, we shall see how the insatiable zest for knowledge, prefigured in Socrates, well, what has it done in our civilization? It has been transformed into tragic resignation of the need for art. While to be sure, on a lower level, that same zest appears hostile to all art, and especially to the truly tragic Dionysian art, as I've tried to show paradigmatically in the subversion of echelon art by Socratism. This is where Nietzsche thinks that people in his time, around the 1870s, and I would say this continues all the way through to his death, think that we are. This is what he's going to later on call the contemporary problem of nihilism. The question that we have to ask at this point is this Socratic-Alexandrian response going to remain ascendant? And there's a suggestion in section 17. I'm skipping over section 16 where he talks about Schopenhauer's use because I just don't have the time right now. There's a suggestion that tragedy can only be reborn when science, the scientific view, the scientific attitude, the Socratic-Alexandrian has been pushed to its limits and renounced claims to universal validity. And has that happened? Had that happened in his time? Has it happened in ours? What would be going on there? A culture that orients itself fundamentally around these ideals would realize itself as hollow, as corrupt, as not measuring up. That would free, or rather, that would open the situation to a resurgence of something which would be like tragedy, Apollonian and Dionysiac, fusing them together. Something that would go beyond that, and that is what Nietzsche wants. Nietzsche thought he saw something like that happening in his own time. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next video. How these different responses play themselves out in modern culture. We've talked about the Greeks now at great length. Now we want to see how it plays out in the modern culture of Nietzsche's time, and we want to see how it plays out, if we can, in the late modern culture of our own time. So that's where we'll leave off.